All right, so you guys may have to acknowledge that this is being recorded. All right. Well, let's get started. We're here with Sam Wells, the vicar of St. Martin's in the Fields in London? I like to call it the other St. Martin's. It's good to have you here, Sam. We have had several groups read The Heart of It All. We are doing a slow read on our Tuesday morning study with it, meaning that we maybe get through 2 or 3 paragraphs at a time. And we have a lot of theological conversation. So we got lots of questions for you, but would love for you to riff as well. I'm wondering if you could just give a quick rundown on what kind of led to you approaching the Bible in this way.
Well, I can't remember what I say in the introduction about how it came to be written. Do I talk about that conversation with Simon? Are you familiar with that background? No. So Simon Russell Beale, who's Shakespearean actor and in all sorts of films that you'd know, most recently that one about Russia. What's it called? That's supposed to be funny, and I didn't find very funny at all. About Stalin. I can't remember. Somebody else might just quickly Google Simon Russell Beale Stalin and see what you get. Anyway, I was having coffee with him, and just across the road from where I'm sitting now, he'd said he'd been approached by Alec, another famous actor called Death of Stalin. Thank you. Anyway, a guy that I remember watching when I was, 30 years ago, do the Gospel of Mark at one go, as an actor, and how moving and meaningful everybody found it. I remember I didn't find it moving and meaningful at all. I found it rather dull. So I told him that and said, but I could do something that would be really worth you doing as a one-man show. Why not do the whole Bible, and I'll do it for you. So that's where it came from. He then got scooped up into all sorts of prestigious things, as he always does, and which I kind of half anticipated, but actually having had the idea, I thought, well, this could be mighty useful, because I've never been in a church, and I've been ordained 30 years now, where people felt they knew the Bible very well. So, and also the people that were really keen would start at Genesis and they get to halfway through Leviticus, if you're lucky, and they say, I'm not doing this anymore. So that, starting at the beginning isn't the answer. And I felt what was required was a mixture of a reasonably brief summary and, hence the title of the book, something that gets to the jugular pretty quickly and also shows interesting correspondences between the New and the Old Testament. So, starting both in exile, was obviously the big motif, that they both start from a position of adversity and find abundance in a situation of adversity. And then really it was just the rest of it was really my best attempt to manage all the material within a reasonably brief length, aiming for the similar length. I think, is it 10,000 words each for the Old and New Testament? It's about that. I can't remember now exactly, but they're pretty much exactly the same length. And I felt that was about right. And then I ended up doing that commentary, which I guess is what I'm talking about now, isn't it? Why I did what I did kind of thing, as that extra section at the end. Which wasn't originally planned, but it was a bit like one long footnote. So,
I remember hearing you say one time that the book of Jonah is sort of the gospel in miniature. It shows what God is up to. I don't recall having Jonah be in the heart of it all. Is there anything that you left out that you really were at pains to leave out?
No, I really tried to have at least a sentence from every book. Okay. So I honestly can't remember if I pulled that off. I don't think I ever went back and really checked. But I just went through it in my head. Some of the so-called minor prophets, I think, are a bit of a challenge to slip in. So it's possible that Jonah didn't make it. But yeah, what I love doing, as I think you know, is taking a passage of scripture and showing how the whole Bible is in that passage, particularly an Old Testament passage, because people are less likely to expect to find it there. But this was never designed to be an exhaustive exercise. This was always designed to be an appetizer, really, and an appetizer, and it's a kind of. Do you have those travel guides that say Los Angeles in 5 days or something like that?
Yeah.
I'm sure you do, and they suggest places you can go. I'd be very surprised if anybody religiously follows exactly what they tell you to do, but you're grateful to have Los Angeles divided into 5 different colors and a bit of a sense of what the feel for each of these areas is, with a bit of a gray saying, I wouldn't bother going there, actually. For one part of town, and then a special pull-out bit about Hollywood and so on. And that's what I've tried to do. If I'm honest, I think the publisher could have been a bit more imaginative with the formatting of what I produced. I was surprised they produced something with such little writing, and I think they were really trying to produce something that was cheap. And there's good reasons for that. It sells better, and I think it sold reasonably well. People have got, it's supposed to be broad, but also identify one motif especially, but also a few others, and then to make a few moves, like saying perhaps the traditional line between what's a miracle and what's a parable is overdrawn. So what if we set them side by side and see that in some ways they're actually doing the same work? So a few points to make. You could call that exegetical, I suppose, but it's in some ways it's a theological point. What is the Bible? What is Revelation? How does it actually work? And obviously, story is a huge motif behind all of it, and a particular story, because the big challenge of the Bible is how there are people in my theological firmament who wouldn't like the language I'm about to use, but I'll use it for the sake of simplicity. How do we, hundreds in my case, thousands in your case, miles away from where these events happened, become part of this story? That's really the big question, and 2,000 years later a long time or a short time? So I've tried to address those very subtly. Yeah,
I thought that you made that point really, really well in the miracles chapter, where where in the midst of these miracles is the question, who do you say that I am? And the response to that is a miracle, right? It's the formation of this community that proclaim Christ as the Messiah, which is a redundant term, Jesus as the Messiah. It's just pedagogically, I was really fascinated in how you started in exile. Where that to me felt like a decidedly, I don't know, it was an informed scholarship of how the Bible came about. Is that what was one of the things you were trying to do, was also show how the Bible came about as being a book of exile?
Yeah, I think so, because I think if you the tradition, as I'm sure many people in the call will know, of historical criticism, going from anything from, shall we say, 1825 till about 1985 as being the fashionable style of criticism of the Bible, is interested in the question of how did the Bible come about, but its answer is, by a confluence of documents, and here we can see, if we examine this verse, how half of it came from one document and it was blended with half from another, or something like that. I'm not terribly interested in that kind of, a lot of it's speculation, very little of it can be proved. And the truth is, we've had the Bible in its current form for much longer than it was that period it was being put together. So that's got to count for something,
right?
So, and particularly, if you read that Christologically, I'm interested in reading the Old Testament that Jesus was reading. So, okay, there may have been 4 different sources that led to the composition of the Pentateuch, broadly speaking. That's not fascinating. That has some interest for me, but what I'm interested in is, I'm when Jesus is quoting from the Psalms, he's quoting from the same book of Psalms that I'm reading every morning. That interests me a lot.
Mm-hmm.
That's much more interesting. So it's more as what I do with the exile, both very assertively with the first kind of paragraph or 2 of the book of chapter 1, but also when I begin the New Testament, is psychologically to say, why would anyone have written the Bible down in the first place? And that, I think that's a question that I don't remember everyone addressing when I was growing up in the church. The Bible was just a given; it was handed down by the angels on a kind of cushion.
That's how I grew up.
Yeah, and you just took it at face value. And then, along you come at 18 years old, or someone said, there wasn't an Abraham, or, who says that the Red Sea parted or something. And then you think, oh, it's all a load of baloney. And I'm trying to give something that's a bit more nuanced than that journey. So, okay, let's, I'll just say something that I've said in a number of different settings, but I find significant and hopefully helpful to this group. When you ask somebody, when were you closest to God, what do they say? They might say, when my daughter was a senior in high school and she went to Toronto with the hockey team and they reached the Final Four, and it was astonishing because it was like the other players parted like waves, and she made her way through for 3 goals in the last 3 minutes, and we made the final, and the Lord was present in those moments. Nobody ever says that. I've never heard anyone say anything like that, except on a televangelist thing or something. Not that I'm sitting up in hotel rooms on Sunday mornings when I should be in church, but you understand what I'm saying. But what they do say is, I got a call from the nurse to the emergency room. My mother was very frail. And I just got this feeling I wanted to sing to her, and I sang, I Need Thee Every Hour. And she squeezed my hand just as I finished the last verse. And then she smiled, and then she was gone. And I felt she'd blessed me, and God had blessed me through her. That's what they, every single 100 times out of 100, that's what people say.
Right.
So, what we're saying is, I think we've got something to learn from this, because funnily enough, that's how the Bible came to be written. The Bible is not a story of making the Final Four in Toronto. But the Bible is a story of someone squeezing your hand in the emergency room, which is what happened in Babylon, in the 6th century, and what happened to the disciples after the crucifixion, and what happened to the disciples in the middle years of the 1st century when Paul was writing, and the later years of the 1st century when Revelation was writing, when they really had their backs to the wall. And isn't that interesting that the way people find faith today and their most meaningful moments in faith today are the same as the way the Bible came to be written? Big reveal.
Yeah.
So, that's it really. Once you've made that journey, you sort of think, well, now I can understand what the Bible's about, because it's what I went through with my mum 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly you think, okay, well, I'm in this story now. I'm really interested in how, just as you would be if you find yourself in a support group of other people whose mums died in the emergency room 3 years ago, you're actually really interested in what they've got to say, because it's not just their similarities, it's the interesting differences of their experience that's absolutely gripping. Now, Vicky wants to come in. I
Yeah,
don't know.
Vicky, go
Are you
ahead.
sharing
And
this or am
folks,
I, Josh? I'm not sure who's in charge
well,
here.
you are now. Carry on, Vicky,
Vicky.
and others can raise their hands.
One of the things that we talked about, nice to meet you, Sam Wells, very excited, is page 29, and this is part of what you're talking about now.
Hold on. I'm just going to get my copy. I'll be back in 10 seconds.
And this is one of the things that folks in our Tuesday group, we all underlined. I think Josh told us to underline it.
Well, what a wonderful church that does what the rector says. I'd like to be in charge of one of those.
Sam. It ends there.
Exactly.
It ends there. Okay. I haven't got any underlinings on page 29, but tell me more.
It is where you say, in exile, we were precious, honored, and loved. And how that sentence really is kind of the thesis for this book, is understanding that this is a love story between humanity and God, the Bible, and in our history with God.
I love that line where you left out a word, Vicky. It says, "In exile, we were yet precious, honored, and loved." To me, that's an important addition to the sentence. What did you mean there? Like, we were surprised to find ourselves even more so, or what?
Despite everything, yeah. Despite everything is what the yet means.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what, Isaiah 43 verse 4, I think. One of those, 4 or 5. And it's a passage I've preached 2 of my favorite sermons on, actually. And one of which appears at the beginning of, Josh will probably tell you which book. I can't honestly remember. But it's at the beginning of one of my books. Where is possibly incarnational ministry? I think possibly. Not 100% sure. I think it might be. Anyway, I just think I find those words fascinating because, I can imagine most of the people on this call have experienced what it means to be loved without being honored. And what it means
it's okay.
to be be precious, but not to be loved. And I just find the 3 of those words are kind of really helpful triangle to explore not just human relationships and a couple of days after Valentine's Day or even the day after, but actually what God's relationship with Israel and with the church is like. So I will almost certainly write a book called Precious, Honored and Loved, because once I find a phrase like that, I never let it go. The book's coming. But to me, that is, I would say that line and set me as a seal upon your heart because love is strong as death in Song of Songs chapter 8 are probably the 2 most important lines in the Old Testament for me.
Thank you. We had a couple of hands. I think Araminta, did you have yours up? And then Linda. I'm gonna you have to unmute yourself, Araminta.
Sorry. Okay. Yes, I did have my hand up. Sam, I'm not a regular member of this group, but I'm a member of another group at St. Martin's, and we're just preparing to read this book and in that group. So I have not, as Josh hoped we would, I have not read the whole book yet. But to go back to what you said early on, it makes sense to me to start with the exile. But I was sort of curious why you began with Daniel. Why not, for example, Lamentations?
Well, I can tell you the 2 answers to that. I didn't begin with Lamentations because Lamentations is really looking back over your shoulder as you're walking from Jerusalem to Babylon. And it's miserable, most of it. I mean, it's got that sort of new every morning, great is your faithfulness bit, but but that's only a couple of verses out of 4 chapters. Whereas if you see the big reveal of the Old Testament was that Israel paradoxically was closer to God in the promise in Babylon than it had ever been in the Promised Land. You don't get that in Lamentations, but you do get that in Daniel 3. In fact, you get it in Daniel 3 more than almost anywhere else. Arguably, you could say a second Isaiah and Isaiah, the 40s and early 50s of Isaiah. And that story, having just said what I think are the 2 most important lines, that, but even if not story in Daniel 3, to me is just a broad sweep story of the central message of the Old Testament, I suppose, which is and also it's fundamental to anyone who's read a few of the books I've written certainly the ones I've written the last 11 years will know that I'm a bit obsessed with the word "with," and the appearance of the 4th figure in the fire. Well, again, this is where I get irritated with a certain way of reading the Bible, because people get obsessed with, it's not Jesus, they weren't talking about Jesus then, it's not a prediction. I mean, I don't care. What I care about is they realized in that 4th figure God was with them. So they weren't rescued from the flames by a dramatic miracle. They weren't prevented from going into the flames by some intervention that stayed the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. The flames weren't suddenly put out by a bunch of water coming from the sky. They found that God was with them in the flames. So the fire is Babylon. Israel wasn't miraculously snapped out of Babylon. There wasn't some, like would happen in the movies, some kind of ambush on the caravan going to Babylon, which enabled them to escape from their persecutors and go back to Jerusalem. None of that. They found that God was with them in Babylon. And again, it's the same point as I go back to the emergency room. It's not Toronto. It's, Mum didn't suddenly wake up and throw off all her machines. She didn't start singing the hymn with you, but you felt God with you as you were holding your mother's hand, and you trusted that she did too, and still does. It's the same point. It is the point that sums up the whole Bible, as far as I'm concerned, which is, God doesn't take all our problems away. God doesn't give us all 55 bouncing, healthy children and the energy to look after them. God doesn't bring us that kind of prosperity, as far as I'm concerned. But God is with us in the valley of the shadow of death. As we walk through the fire, the flames will not consume you. I am with you. That is the whole Bible, as far as I'm concerned. That is Jesus's last words in Matthew's Gospel. I'm with you always. That's what Emmanuel means. God with us. You see, it's the whole thing is one big with, as far as I'm concerned. And Daniel makes that point, and Lamentations doesn't.
Plus, it's also like wildly dramatic, right? It's just an amazing.
It is an extraordinary story. Yeah. But it's basically 2 points to Daniel, no points to Lamentations.
Linda Day.
Who was next?
Linda. Can you unmute Linda?
Am I to call you Zoom user?
Yes, that's her name.
Which is actually a very nice name. There's not many Zs on the call today. So, sorry, Z, you would say. But,
yeah. Linda, can you unmute?
I think it's going to be sign language.
Yeah. She's really wise too. We definitely want to hear from Linda.
Does anyone know the question that Linda was obviously going to ask? Because she always does. Maybe you can put it in the chat. Put it in the chat, Linda.
While she's finding her on mute, I did want to kind of pick up on something that occurred to me, because it seems to me that most of the scholarship that we have, at least in Episcopal seminaries and certainly through the Education for Ministry program, is focused highly on the historical critical approach. And this book, I think, does a lot to move people beyond that, not as a replacement or saying that the historical critical is bad, but is the cure to move beyond historical critical to understand the emotional state of those who were writing?
Well, I don't believe that you can, in literary criticism terms, limit yourself to authorial intention. I think all the different, in the first few centuries of the Bible, they, as is well known, they had these 4 different ways of reading the Bible, of which the most interesting today is probably the allegorical sense, but there were 3 others. And to me, I see this as a bit like the conversation people have in the Episcopal Church, because I was in an Episcopal church preaching in Alabama 10 days ago, where they were absolutely having this conversation about whether God abhors the guitar or the drum, even though it gets mentioned a lot in the Bible, or that the only route to salvation is through an organ. And why wouldn't we want to use all the different forms of music God gives us? They might not all be our personal taste, but hopefully, people say nothing really happens to you when you're ordained. I hope what happens to you in you're ordained is you stop thinking about worship just as something that builds you up, and you start thinking about what builds up a whole community. And all kinds of worship styles of music and things can do that. And likewise, all kinds of criticism of the Bible can have their uses at different times, I think. I've certainly had fascinating sessions looking at the story of the parting of the Red Sea with the aid of historical criticism, looking at how the different stories formed each other, and had a really instructive time understanding how that story was put together. I've also had, in a different genre, a really instructive time with a group looking at the Eucharistic prayers that are assigned in, this would be in an English context, but you could do the same with the 1979 book. And that's, you can do sort of source criticism of that as well. Where did the Calvinist bits come in? Where did the Lutheran bits come in? What still remains as a Catholic bit? Which bits are bits of Zwinglian? That's a really interesting exercise. So I would say you use all of these different things. Susie, I think, is. Oh, no, Linda is back, because I saw an unmuted Linda.
Yeah, appear. Linda, I had to mute you. Can you unmute one more time? Because you were feeding back. Go ahead.
Okay. Am I good?
Let me mute myself.
Okay.
All right. Okay, so Linda, go into the chat function right down at the bottom and just type in, and we will get to it, because I want to hear what you have to say, but the sound is a little rough.
We're extremely excited now, Linda.
Yes.
You've really kind of built us up to this.
The
You're going to have to put it in the chat. So, Susie.
Yeah.
Yes. I was struck by reading the commentary, and in some ways, I wish I may have read that before I read the book. But throughout the book, you use the term "we," and we were struck by it and even talked about it in our discussion. But for those that have not read the commentary, talk about why you did use that word throughout the book.
Well, we sometimes talk about the difference between revelation and experience. but revelation is just the experience of our forebears. Everything in the Bible had to be an experience before it was written down and became revelation. Do you see what I mean? So it's a false distinction, really. I always say that the distinction between mission and maintenance is a false distinction, because maintenance is cherishing your predecessor's mission. So it's a similar point. And the way the Bible works is in the formation of a people, Israel, and then in the New Testament, the expansion of that people to include the Gentiles, to the whole world. And so the Bible is a record of those people's encounters with God. And so it's sometimes written in the third person, but it's in every case written by somebody who feels they're part of that we. Even the lament passages, Lamentations most obviously, is a we. It is an experience in which the writer shares. The miracle of baptism, the miracle of grace, is that you and I are grafted into that we. And whereas we might, when you say you wish you'd read the commentary first, you can read this as many times as you like. You've got my full permission to do that. But
and buy it for others.
What I would like to think is that if you find the we a bit jarring at the beginning, by the end you wholeheartedly embrace it. We is a very problematic word in America today. You don't need me to tell you that. It's probably one of the most dangerous words because of how many people have not been included in that we. But this is a kind of, to use a jargony term, an eschatological we. This is the we of heaven, in which we all belong and find our place. But you might need to read the story more than once to see how that happens and what the decisive moments are, Pentecost being the kind of defining one, really. So I think that's my best way to answer it.
I'd like to just comment on that and maybe draw it out a little more. I noticed that I became the rector of St. Martin's maybe like 6 months to a year after I started there. I started talking about we as opposed to they. Mm. And I notice in my colleagues that when they start talking about their congregation as they, there's a rift, right? So it's kind of that I, thou stuff, where you feel yourself included. I am wondering what you would say in light of what you said about the eschatological we, which is totally something I'm using. What about those critical schools that make a statement that's true, that almost the entire Bible was written while under occupation of some kind? Mm-hmm. Can groups that belong to historic oppressive peoples, oppressive, not oppressed, read the Bible? This is still a live question for me. Can 21st century white Americans read the Bible?
Well, I think that without getting too political about it, but getting quite political about it, Trump's genius was, and I'm going to use the past tense because I want to, not because I think it's necessarily entirely justified, but Trump's genius was to tell a story that made him chief amongst the victims. And, having spent some time in Alabama last week, I met a number of people who identify with that story while driving away in enormous cars. and it's, that's the genius of your former president. So Mike, the reason I'm mentioning that is that a great many people who you and I might call oppressors and others might call oppressors don't see themselves that way. And so that the Bible is, as you and I have discussed before, written for those with their backs to the wall, as Howard Thurman put it. Almost everybody can identify some sense in which they do have their backs to the wall. It may not be economically, but go back to Donald Trump. I mean, I don't envy that man for one moment. His treatment by his father must be part of the cause for the way he's ended up, and the reason why he sees himself as a victim when the rest of the world sees him as an oppressor. Well, not the 73 million, I suppose, but the rest of the world apart from them. So, I suppose I would say, as a pastor, I would say it's not all about economics. But you're right to say the burden of proof lies with those with the economic upper hand, shall we say? Those who are the slave masters of the 2020s, as opposed to the pre-1860s. Mm-hmm. It's for those to show the church and the world that they're not oppressors. Simplest way to do that is to stop being so. But that's easier than said than done. If you're tied into a social and economic system that requires a number of things that do exploit others and to make them possible.
Thank you. I'm feeling really hopeful about Linda Day on a different device on Catherine's.
Wow. Change of name, of course, is always a good tip. Yeah, go on.
Hi, Sam.
Fantastic. I feel like Adam touching the hand of God. We've finally made contact.
Okay. Now, first of all, I want to say I listened to your sermon about a month and a half ago, when it was precious, honored, and loved.
Okay, good. So you can tell everybody else about it.
It was wonderful, and it is still with me. And recently I started thinking about God, that I tell God, you are precious, honored, and loved. And it made me feel more intimately connected, because I was opening myself more to that vision of God. St. Martin's in the Fields comes into my house about 2 to 3 times a week. So Katherine and Richard, I love walking on Saturday morning with them. And I love you and Sally having your little debate with the sermon prep, which will take place soon, right?
In about 50 minutes, yeah.
Well, anyway, I'd like to ask you to tell some of the metaphors that you use throughout the book for Israel. Everything eventually turns out to be Israel.
Yes, I think that's a great point. So, I mean, I guess, I often say when we're doing the sermon preparations, you'll be familiar that Mary, every time she pops up in the New Testament, is fundamentally Israel, but secondarily the church. So to give an example of that, at the foot of the cross with the beloved disciple, it seems to me she is, or they are, the church. But also she standing next to the beloved disciple are like the church and Israel. Son, behold your mother, mother, behold your son. There you go. It's simple as that. That would just be one illustration of the ways you've got to work out what's going on. But again, to go back to where we started in Babylon, the question the Bible sort of starts with is, do you know the old joke about the three polar bears and the mummy polar bear and the daddy polar bear and the baby polar bear. And, you know, the baby polar bear says, it's a longer joke, but I'll cut it short. You know, so am I a baby polar bear? And, you know, mummy and daddy both say, well, you know, I'm a polar bear, the other one's a polar bear, you're a baby polar bear. And so the baby says, so why am I so cold then? and it's basically, why am I so cold? I mean, that is the problem. You know, again, that's kind of what I start both halves of the book with, is why is Israel such a mess if it's precious, honored, and loved? Yeah. You know, that is, you know, show me that is the Old Testament in a sentence, really. And then the New Testament is partly, why is the church in a mess if it's the new creation? And partly, so what happened to Israel again? You know, those are the questions that dominate the Old and New Testaments. And I did a bit of writing about this in a rightly neglected book called Speaking the Truth, but I wrote an essay in there about what I call the 3-chapter story of the American church. And what I was talking about partly is how America appropriated what's written about Israel in the Old Testament. They're not the only country to have done it, because Britain did it before them. France had a go. But America did it. So as my friend Scott Bader Say puts it in one of his books, America was God's chosen people with tenure.
So
you know, but the reason for mentioning that is that, and he picks up on things like even Bill Clinton's rhetoric in his inauguration address, talking about, you know, really playing into this God's chosen people kind of motif. And, you know, it's fascinating. But the point of mentioning that is that we've kind of airbrushed Israel out of our reading of the scriptures. And, you know, you could call that anti-Semitic if you wanted to make it argumentative. But whether it was for that reason or a bunch of other quite plausible reasons, you know, we do need to go back and reread the Bible, and hopefully this little book is a stimulus for people to do that, and realize it is not a story about us. It's a story about other people into which we've been graciously included. Yeah, so that's the main point, really.
So are we due for exile next?
Well, I think you could, I mean, in some ways the pandemic has been an experience like that, because it's I imagine for everyone on this call, you've done exactly what Israel did in exile. You've mourned what you've lost, and it could be people you've lost. You have realized you needed new things, or to develop hidden talents that you had never needed to work on before, possibly being on Zoom. And you've had to reevaluate who you are and what you're committed to and how you spend your time in the light of what you've learned in this adversarial situation that you never wished to happen, but actually has taught you some pretty useful things.
Yes.
And so in that sense, exile is a really helpful motif for the last 2 years, I think.
And to realize, this is the first learning I had from Sam, was just how surprised the people of Israel were to find God even closer to them in exile than in Jerusalem. We are at time. Sam is over time on what he can give us. Thank you so much for blessing us. This has been a deeply prayerful time. Any final words for us, Sam?
Well, I think it's wonderful to have a group of people like this. It's a privilege for me to feel that you're taking my writing seriously, and if you stay close to Josh, you'll be on the right lines, I think.
Check is in the mail, Sam.
Yeah. Great to be with you. Thanks
God
for having
bless
me.
you all. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
See you around.